In the early 1900s, a janitor named Henry Wade would load leather bags of cash into a wheelbarrow and push it down a brick-paved street in Bramwell, West Virginia, from the Bank of Bramwell to the train depot, an armed guard walking beside him. Nobody in town looked twice. There was that much money moving through that little place. 14 Norfolk and Western passenger trains stopped in Bramwell every day. At least 13 millionaires, some accounts say as many as 19, lived in mansions along that brick street, a town of maybe 4,000 people that had, per capita, more millionaires than anywhere else in the United States. The Bank of Bramwell financed coal operations across southern West Virginia, funded the construction of the Burning Tree Country Club in Washington, D.C., where presidents would one day play golf, and sold more World War I Liberty bonds, relative to its size, than any bank in the country. Today, Bramwell's population is 277. The median household income is about $22,000. A quarter of the children live below the poverty line. The brick street is still there. So are many of the mansions, maintained now by people from all walks of life, some of them lovingly restored, others quietly weathering. The train station is a museum. Henry Wade's wheelbarrow route has become a walking tour. And the money, all of it, every dollar that was ever loaded into those leather bags and sent rattling down the tracks, is gone. It has been gone for a very long time. This is the story of how the richest region in America became its poorest. Not through war, not through natural disaster, not through some sudden catastrophe, through a deal. A set of deals, really, executed over decades that separated the people who lived on the land from the wealth beneath it. The deals were legal. They were voluntary in the narrow sense of the word. And they created a pattern of extraction so thorough that Appalachia has never recovered from its own prosperity. The mountains of Appalachia stretch from southern New York to northern Alabama, a spine of ridges and hollows running roughly 1,000 miles down the eastern United States. The region is defined by its geography: steep terrain, narrow valleys, dense forests, and rivers that cut through the landscape in ways that made large-scale farming impractical and travel difficult for most of its history. Before the Civil War, the people who lived in these mountains were largely self-sufficient. They farmed the bottomlands, hunted the ridges, made what they needed, sold or traded what they could. They were not wealthy by any American standard, but they owned their land. That fact, that simple, unremarkable fact of ownership, is the hinge on which the entire story turns. What lay beneath that land was almost incomprehensibly valuable. The Appalachian coalfield is the largest in eastern North America. The seams run through 7 states, and in some places the coal was 8 to 10 feet thick. Massive deposits of high-quality bituminous and semi-bituminous coal, the kind that burned hot and clean enough to power locomotives, heat cities, and forge steel. The Pocahontas coal field, which began near Bramwell and extended over 40 miles along the Virginia-West Virginia border, produced what operators marketed as smokeless coal, a premium product that commanded top dollar from railroads and urban customers who didn't want their parlors blackened by soot. When commercial mining began in the Pocahontas field in 1882, after the Norfolk and Western Railway completed its line to the area, the coal that came out of those mountains was some of the most desired fuel on earth. But the people sitting on top of it didn't know what they had, or if they knew, they didn't know what it was worth. And into that gap between what the land contained and what its owners understood stepped some of the most consequential middlemen in American economic history. In the 1880s, a schoolteacher from Paintsville, Kentucky, named John C. Mayo began traveling through the hollows of eastern Kentucky, knocking on cabin doors with a leather satchel and a simple proposition. He wanted to buy mineral rights, not the land itself, just the rights to whatever was underneath it. He offered 10 cents an acre. For landowners who were more resistant, he'd go as high as $1. The sums were small enough that many families treated them as found money, a few dollars for something they couldn't see and had never used. Over 20 years, Mayo accumulated mineral rights to hundreds of thousands of acres, often reselling them to northern industrialists for 3 or 4 times what he'd paid. By the time he died, he was reputed to be the wealthiest man in Kentucky. What made Mayo's deals possible, and what made the entire transformation of Appalachia possible, was a legal instrument called the Broad Form Deed. Created in the early 1900s, but rooted in practices from the 1880s, the Broad Form Deed didn't just transfer mineral rights. It severed a single piece of property into 2 separate estates, the surface, which the family kept, and everything beneath it, which now belonged to someone else. The mineral estate owner received the right to extract coal, oil, gas, or any other resource by whatever means they deemed necessary, to build any infrastructure required, to use any surface resources, timber, water, in the process, and to do all of this without liability for damage to the surface. A family could own their farm, their house, their garden, and have absolutely no legal power to prevent a mining company from tearing it all apart to reach the coal underneath. By 1810, as much as 93% of the land in present-day West Virginia was already held by absentee owners, a legacy of colonial-era land grants. By the 1880s, outside interests began purchasing the timber and underground mineral rights on a massive scale. A study conducted by the Appalachian Land Ownership Task Force in 1979 and 1980, covering 80 counties in 6 Appalachian states, found that corporations control roughly 40% of the surface land and about 70% of the mineral rights in the counties surveyed. Nearly 3/4 of the surface acres and 4/5 of the mineral estate were owned by people and entities that didn't live there. The wealth of the mountains had been bought, legally, for a fraction of its value, and the people who remained on the surface owned little more than the view. The timber went first. Before the coal operators arrived in force, lumber companies stripped the virgin forests of southern Appalachia, hardwood stands that had been growing since before European contact. They used sawmill innovations and logging railroads to reach timber that had been inaccessible for centuries. By the early 1900s, virtually all of eastern Kentucky's old-growth timber had been cut. The companies left behind eroded hillsides, silted streams, and land that would never fully recover. It was practice, in a sense, for what came next. The speed of the coal rush was staggering. In 1882, the first commercial mine opened in Pocahontas, Virginia, just across the state line from Bramwell. In 1884, John Cooper operated the first mine on the West Virginia side of the flat-top coalfield, shipping his first load over the Norfolk and Western on November 4th of that year. Within a decade, the Flat Top Coal Company, later renamed the Pocahontas Land Corporation, was leasing its vast holdings to individual operators rather than mining them directly, a strategy designed to avoid charges of monopoly while extracting revenue from every direction at once. Operators recruited miners from the anthracite fields of Pennsylvania, directly from Ellis Island, from the coal towns of England, Scotland, and Wales, and from black communities in the Deep South. The coal boom that followed reshaped Appalachia more thoroughly than any force in its history. Between 1880 and 1930, more than 600 company towns were built across the region. They outnumbered independent towns 5-1. At the height of the coal boom, 78% of all coal miners and their families in Appalachia lived in a company-owned community, a place where the mine operator owned the houses, the store, the school, the church, and often the local government. The company town was not merely an employer, it was a total institution. You were born in a company house. You bought your groceries at the company store. You were paid not in U.S. currency, but in scrip, metal tokens or paper vouchers stamped with the company's name, redeemable only at that company's store, where prices were often marked up well above what independent merchants charged. Your rent, your coal for heating, your lamp oil, your tools, All of it was deducted from your wages before you ever saw a pay envelope. On payday, it was not uncommon for a miner to open his envelope and find nothing inside but a statement showing he still owed the company money. The mountain people had a phrase for the curling line drawn across an empty pay slip. They called it the snake. The operators, meanwhile, lived beautifully. Bramwell was designed specifically as a residential enclave for the coal elite, built just beyond the edge of the coal field so that the men who ran the mines wouldn't have to live next to them. The town sat in a meander of the Bluestone River, tucked into a small valley, quiet and green. Before 1900, it had electric streetlights, a water company, telephone service, and a weekly newspaper. The Cooper Mansion, a 24-room Queen Anne built in 1910 of orange brick imported from England, had a copper roof and an indoor swimming pool. Dr. McGuffin's house, built in 1885 for the town's first physician, had indoor plumbing, a shower, and a speaking tube running from the front door to his bedroom. The Goodwill House had a ballroom. Isaac T. Mann's mansion featured leather wall coverings imported from Venezuela and a stained glass chandelier. Mann himself was perhaps the most powerful of the Bramwell operators, a Greenbrier County native who in 1901 traveled to New York for a meeting with J.P. Morgan. In what became a famous 7-minute interview, Mann secured Morgan's backing for a scheme to acquire coal-bearing lands in McDowell County. He went on to serve as president of the Pocahontas Fuel Company for 3 decades, controlled a chain of 9 banks, and maintained homes in Washington, Maine, and Florida. His 1923 fortune was estimated at $18 to $25 million, the equivalent of roughly $300 million today. Remember that wheelbarrow on the brick street, money being rolled from the bank to the train, headed somewhere else. That image is the entire story of Appalachia in a single frame. The coal came out of the mountains by the millions of tons. It went north to heat cities, west to feed blast furnaces, east to the ports at Norfolk for export. The profits went to Philadelphia, New York, London, to the shareholders and financiers who had bought the mineral rights and built the railroads. The Pocahontas coal fields alone employed over 100,000 miners. The Bank of Bramwell handled their payroll. But the real business, the serious capital, was always headed out of town. The coal operators spent lavishly in Bramwell, yes. They built beautiful homes and donated stone churches. But the structural wealth, the mineral rights, the railroad stock, the corporate profits never belonged to the region. It passed through the way coal passed through a tipple. In, weighed, out. The human cost of that arrangement was paid underground. On the morning of December 6, 1907, at 10:28 a.m., an explosion tore through the Fairmont Coal Company's mines number 6 and number 8 in Monongah, West Virginia. The blast was felt 8 miles away. It shattered buildings, knocked streetcars off their rails, and sent a column of black dust and smoke over the valley. 362 men and boys were killed, though the actual number was almost certainly higher because registered miners routinely brought their children and relatives underground to help, and those extra bodies were never counted on the company rolls. The mines were connected by an underground shaft, a design flaw that meant an explosion in one spread instantly to the other. The ventilation fans were destroyed. Rescue teams could work in 15-minute shifts before the carbon monoxide drove them back. The last survivor, a Polish miner named Peter Urban, was found sitting on the shattered body of his brother, staring into the dark. 216 women were widowed. More than 500 children lost their fathers, with another 31 born after the disaster. Fairmont Coal's lawyer, a former governor named A. Brooks Fleming, told the widows the company would offer $150 in compensation. "I think the money would be quite a Christmas present," he said. Monongah was not an anomaly. It was a particularly bad day in a particularly bad year. In 1907 alone, more than 3,000 Americans were killed in mine accidents, 18 coal mine disasters in a single 12-month period. The December that included Monongah also saw deadly explosions at the Naomi Mine in Pennsylvania, the Dar Mine on the Youghiogheny River, and the Yolande Mine in Alabama. The public outcry that followed eventually led to the creation of the United States Bureau of Mines in 1910, but enforcement remained weak for decades. West Virginia had a higher mine death rate than any other state in the nation, and the companies that profited from those mines fought every regulation proposed. The miners knew their position. They understood the mathematics of it, that they were being paid in company scrip to dig company coal from company land and spend their wages at company stores that charged company prices, while the real money left on company trains. And they began to organize. The United Mine Workers of America had been trying to unionize the southern West Virginia coal fields for years, but the operators fought back with a ferocity that bordered on warfare. They hired the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, a private security firm with a reputation for violence against labor organizers, to infiltrate the union, evict striking miners from company housing, and intimidate anyone who talked about organizing. The Baldwin Felts agents had been responsible for the Ludlow Massacre in Colorado in 1914, where National Guardsmen and company detectives attacked a tent colony of striking miners' families, killing 66 people, including at least 11 children. On May 19, 1912, Baldwin Felts detectives arrived in Matewan in Mingo County to carry out evictions of miners who had joined the Union. They ejected families at gunpoint, dumping their belongings in the road in the rain. When the agents tried to leave town, they were confronted by Matewan's police chief, Sid Hatfield, a young man from the Tug River Valley who had sided openly with the miners. The mayor, Cabell Testerman, examined a warrant the agents produced for Hatfield's arrest and declared it fraudulent. What happened next is still debated, but the result is not. A gunfight erupted on Mate Street, and when it ended, 7 Baldwin Felts detectives lay dead, including the founders' 2 brothers, Albert and Lee Felts. The mayor was dead too, and 2 miners. But the agents, the feared, seemingly invincible agents, had been beaten. Word spread through every coal camp in southern West Virginia. Sid Hatfield became a folk hero. 15 months later, on August 1st, 1921, Hatfield traveled to the McDowell County Courthouse in Welch to stand trial on charges of dynamiting a coal tipple. He brought his friend, Ed Chambers. Their wives came along. As Hatfield and Chambers walked up the courthouse steps, Baldwin Felts agents ambushed them. Both men were shot dead. One agent walked down the steps and put an additional bullet into the back of Chambers' head. The murder of Sid Hatfield broke something open. Within days, thousands of Union miners gathered at Marmet near the state capital of Charleston. Led by UMWA organizers Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney, they resolved to march south to Mingo County, through Logan County, to confront the coal companies directly. By August 24th, roughly 10,000 armed miners were on the move. Many were veterans of the First World War. They tied red bandanas around their necks to identify one another in the forest. They became known as the Redneck Army. The marching army was remarkably diverse. Black miners, white Appalachian hill folk, Polish and Hungarian and Italian immigrants, men who were kept segregated in the company towns, who ate in separate cafeterias and lived in separate housing, marched together, slept in the same camps, and in at least one documented incident held cafeteria workers at gunpoint until they were all served food in the same room. The coal companies had deliberately mixed racial and ethnic groups to prevent organizing. It hadn't worked. Logan County Sheriff Don Chafin, who was on the payroll of the Logan Coal Operators Association, organized a defense force of roughly 2,000 men at Blair Mountain. It was, at that moment, the largest private armed force ever assembled in the United States. The Battle of Blair Mountain raged for 5 days, from late August into early September 1921. Chafin's forces had machine guns and hired private biplanes to drop homemade pipe bombs and tear gas on the marching miners. It was the largest armed conflict on American soil since the Civil War. The fighting stopped only when President Warren G. Harding sent in federal troops. The miners, many of them former soldiers, refused to fire on the U.S. Army. They hid their guns in the woods and went home. The aftermath was devastating for the Union. West Virginia charged 925 miners with murder, conspiracy, and treason against the state. The legal battles emptied the UMWA's treasury. Membership in West Virginia collapsed from 50,000 to fewer than 1,000 within 5 years. The coal operators had won decisively, and they would keep winning until the New Deal. The miners' brief, bloody attempt to seize some share of the wealth beneath their feet had been put down with bombs dropped from biplanes. The Great Depression arrived in Appalachia the way it arrived everywhere. But in Appalachia, it arrived on top of a regional depression that had already been grinding since the early 1920s, when overproduction and market competition began undercutting coal prices. Isaac T. Mann, the most powerful man in the Pocahontas coal fields, watched his overextended business empire collapse in 1929. He died in Washington in 1932 at 68 of a heart attack. His son William committed suicide later that same year at the age of 33. The Bank of Bramwell, solid as the Bank of Bramwell, the old saying went, was liquidated in 1933. The wheelbarrow stopped rolling. The New Deal brought the Union back. The National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, and later the Wagner Act, gave miners the legal right to organize, and the UMWA, led by John L. Lewis, swept back through the coal fields. By the mid-1930s, the southern West Virginia mines were organized again. The Union won better wages, safer conditions, and an end to some of the worst abuses of the scrip system. But the New Deal also began something else, mechanization. And mechanization would do to the coal workforce what the operators and the Baldwin-Felts agents never quite managed. It would make most of them unnecessary. World War II created one final enormous surge in demand. The nation needed coal for steel, for ships, for the war machine. At the end of the war, the Appalachian region employed roughly 475,000 miners. Then the war ended, and two things happened almost simultaneously. First, the railroads, coal's single largest customer, began switching from steam locomotives to diesel. Second, new technologies for continuous mining, and eventually strip mining, meant that a handful of men with machines could extract what had once required hundreds of men with picks and shovels. Between the late 1940s and the end of the 1950s, nearly 250,000 mining jobs vanished from Appalachia. West Virginia alone lost 75,000 mining positions in that single decade. The people followed the jobs out. Between 1950 and 1970, more than 3 million people left Appalachia, one of the largest internal migrations in American peacetime history, comparable in scale only to the great migration of black Americans to northern cities. They called the routes they traveled the Hillbilly Highway. West Virginians went to Cleveland, to Columbus, to the factory towns of eastern Ohio. Eastern Kentuckians took U.S. Route 23 north to Cincinnati, or pushed on to Dayton, to Detroit, to Chicago. They found work in auto plants, rubber factories, steel mills, the very industries that had been consuming Appalachian coal for decades. They brought their music, their food, their accents, and their fierce loyalty to the United Mine Workers. And they left behind the hollows and the company towns, the commissaries and the churches, the cemeteries on the hillsides where their grandfathers were buried. The towns they left behind didn't so much decline as empty. In Harlan County, Kentucky, which had more than 350 operating mines in the late 1970s, the number dropped to around 40. Entire communities, places that had been built by coal companies on coal money for coal workers, simply ceased to function. The stores closed. The schools consolidated. The young people, the ones with options, kept leaving. The people who stayed were often the old, the sick, the loyal, and the stubborn. People who loved the mountains enough, or had no choice, but to remain in a landscape that had been mined, logged, eroded, and in many places physically demolished. Then America discovered that Appalachia was poor. This came as a surprise, mainly to people who hadn't been paying attention. In the spring of 1960, a Harvard-educated Catholic senator from Massachusetts named John F. Kennedy traveled through West Virginia to campaign in the state's presidential primary. It was a critical test. If a Catholic couldn't win a heavily Protestant Appalachian state, his candidacy was finished. Kennedy spent weeks driving up and down the hollows, shaking hands with miners and their families. And what he saw shook him. The poverty was not abstract. It was skeletal children, collapsing shacks, communities with no running water, no medical care, no visible economy of any kind. Kennedy won the primary, and he carried with him the images of what he'd seen. He promised to do something about it. The following year, Alderson and Chloe Munsey of Painesville, West Virginia, became the first recipients of federal food stamps, a symbolic fulfillment of the promise Kennedy had made. In 1963, a Whitesburg, Kentucky lawyer and state legislator named Harry Caudill published a book called Night Comes to the Cumberlands, a biography of a depressed area. Caudill was a native of the coalfields, descended from generations of mountain people, and his book did something that no journalist or politician had managed. It explained, in devastating, story-driven detail, exactly how Appalachia had become poor. Not because the people were backward, not because the culture was deficient, but because the wealth of the region had been systematically extracted by outside interests who took the coal, the timber, and the profits and left behind poverty and damaged land. The book caught the attention of the Kennedy White House. The New York Times sent Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Homer Biggert to Whitesburg, and his series on conditions in the mountains further amplified the story. Kennedy appointed a commission to investigate conditions in Appalachia. He was assassinated before it could act. 7 weeks after Kennedy's death, on January 8, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson declared an unconditional war on poverty before Congress. Appalachia was the centerpiece. The Appalachian Regional Commission, originally created by Kennedy in 1963, was given expanded powers by Congress in 1965 and began funneling billions of dollars into the region: roads, bridges, schools, water systems, health clinics. The war on poverty launched Head Start, Job Corps, community action agencies, and a constellation of programs aimed at lifting the mountain counties out of destitution. The money helped. Some of it helped a great deal. Northern and southern Appalachia gradually pulled closer to national averages on many measures. But central Appalachia, the coalfield counties of eastern Kentucky, southern West Virginia, and southwestern Virginia, the places where the extraction had been most intense and the ownership most concentrated, stayed stubbornly, almost defiantly poor. In 1960, Central Appalachia had a poverty rate of 59.4%. By 2000, it had fallen to about 23%. Better, certainly, but still nearly double the national rate of 13.4%. The billions spent by the ARC and the federal government had built roads and hospitals and schools, but they hadn't altered the fundamental equation. The mineral rights still belonged to outside corporations. The profits from whatever coal was still being mined still left on the train. The broad form deed was still on the books in most states. Kentucky didn't amend its constitution to restrict its use until 1988, more than a century after the first deeds were signed. And the coal kept declining. Appalachian production peaked around 1990 and has fallen ever since, with the decline accelerating sharply after 2008. Between 2005 and 2020, coal production across Appalachia dropped by more than 65%, from over 400 million short tons to around 168 million. The culprit was not regulation primarily, though the industry said so loudly. The culprit was cheap natural gas from hydraulic fracturing, which made coal uncompetitive for electricity generation, the one market that had sustained the industry after the railroad switched to diesel and homes switched to oil and gas heat. At the height of the boom, the Appalachian coal fields had employed more than 700,000 men. By 2021, the number was 23,000. By 2023, it had recovered slightly to about 28,000, a workforce that could fit in a mid-sized college football stadium. The mountains themselves are now part of the story's final chapter. Mountaintop removal mining, a technique that became widespread in the 1970s and 1980s, does exactly what it sounds like. To reach thin or deep coal seams that are uneconomical to mine underground, companies use explosives to blast away the tops of mountains, then use enormous drag lines to scoop out the coal. The overburden, the rock and soil that used to be the mountaintop, is dumped into adjacent valleys, burying streams and permanently altering the landscape. It is, in a sense, the broad form deed's final expression, the legal right to destroy the surface taken to its logical conclusion. The families who signed those deeds in the 1880s, who sold their mineral rights for a dime an acre, could not have imagined that the right they were selling included the right to remove the mountain itself. But that is what the language permitted. Consider the mathematics of this story. A family in eastern Kentucky in 1890 sells the mineral rights to their 100-acre farm for $10, 10 cents an acre. The coal beneath that farm over the next century generates millions of dollars in revenue. The profits go to a holding company based in Philadelphia. The taxes paid on those mineral rights to the local county are negligible. Tiny property taxes, as one historian put it, because the assessed value of mineral rights bears almost no relationship to the revenue they produce. The county, unable to collect meaningful tax revenue from the mineral wealth beneath its own soil, cannot fund adequate schools, roads, or health services. The family on the surface watches the coal leave on trains they don't own, processed at tipples they don't control, generating wealth they will never see. Their grandchildren grow up in one of the poorest counties in the United States, in a region that produced more energy than almost any comparable area on Earth. This is not a story of market forces doing their neutral work. It is a story of a specific set of legal and financial arrangements that channeled wealth in one direction, out, and left behind a population that had been separated from its own resources by documents most of them barely understood when they signed them. 99% of the residents of Appalachia control less than half the land. The phrase that scholars use for this arrangement is internal colony, a place within a nation that functions economically the way a colony functions for an empire. The raw materials leave, the profits leave, the environmental costs and the human costs stay. Harry Caudill saw it clearly in 1963. He wrote that the vast natural wealth of the region had been swept out of the mountains, into the pockets of outland capitalists, and into the expansion of the larger industrial order. In return, a deep and lasting depression had settled over the coves. He predicted with eerie accuracy that one day the federal government would have to spend billions of dollars to repair the environmental damage done by extraction, and that the same coal operators who made the mess would be hired to fix it, and the taxpayers would bear the cost. The Appalachian Regional Commission has existed for more than 60 years now. It has invested billions. The results are real but uneven. Highways connect places that were once hours of bad road from the nearest town. Community colleges train workers. Broadband is slowly arriving. Tourism, heritage tourism, outdoor recreation, the Hatfield-McCoy Trail System brings some revenue to places that have no other obvious industry. But the demographic trends in Central Appalachia are stark. Between 2020 and 2025, 16 West Virginia counties in the ARC's Central Appalachian region saw the largest percentage population losses of any counties in the entire Commission's territory. Demographers project that by 2050, some coalfield counties could lose nearly half their remaining population. The outmigration that began in the 1950s hasn't stopped. It has simply changed character. In the 50s and 60s, birth rates were high enough that even as adults left, children were being born who might return. Today, the outmigration is compounded by what demographers call natural decrease, more deaths than births. The population isn't just leaving, it's aging out. Drive through McDowell County, West Virginia today, the county that was the heart of the Pocahontas coalfield, the county where Isaac T. Mann's Pocahontas Fuel Company once employed thousands. In 1950, the county had about 100,000 residents. The 2020 census counted fewer than 19,000. The county seat of Welch, where Sid Hatfield was murdered on the courthouse steps in 1921, has a population under 2,000. Many of the old company towns are gone entirely, reclaimed by kudzu and second-growth forest, their foundations crumbling, their company stores collapsing. In some hollows, you can still find the concrete pads where the houses stood, the stone retaining walls the Italian masons built, the rusted rails of the spur lines that carried the coal out. The wealth, measured in today's dollars, is almost impossible to calculate. The Pocahontas coalfield alone produced hundreds of millions of tons of coal over more than a century. At various points, coal was West Virginia's largest industry, its largest employer, and its largest source of tax revenue, though the tax revenue was always a fraction of what it should have been because the companies that owned the mineral rights were adept at minimizing their assessments. The coal that came out of these mountains powered the steel mills of Pittsburgh, heated the brownstones of Boston, fueled the locomotives that built a continental railroad network, and generated the electricity that lit American cities for most of the 20th century. The region contributed more to American industrialization than almost any other, and it was compensated with company scrip. There is one more irony, the largest of all. The legal instrument that made this possible, the broad-form deed, the document that severed surface rights from mineral rights and allowed outside corporations to extract wealth without accountability, was not imposed by conquest or colonial decree. It was an American innovation, crafted by American lawyers, signed by American citizens, enforced by American courts. The people who signed those deeds were not coerced at gunpoint. They were offered small sums of money for something they didn't fully understand by agents who did. The system that impoverished Appalachia operated entirely within the law. That is the part of the story that is hardest to sit with, and the part that matters most. The wealth was not stolen. It was purchased cheaply and carried away. In Bramwell, the brick street still runs past the old mansions. The Edward Cooper House still has its copper roof, now green with patina. The Bank of Bramwell building, which never had a sign because everyone knew what it was, still stands, its rare red oak paneling and carved gargoyle decorations intact. The Bramwell Presbyterian Church, built of local bluestone in 1903 and 1904, funded by Isaac T. Mann and patterned after a small Welsh cathedral, still holds services. The high school team is still called the Millionaires. The town was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1983, and twice a year, in spring and at Christmas, costumed interpreters guide visitors through the mansions and tell the story of coal and money and the people who lived here when Bramwell was the richest little town in America. The train doesn't stop anymore. There is no janitor pushing a wheelbarrow of cash down to the depot. The money left Bramwell a long time ago, the same way it left every coal town and every hollow in every county across the Appalachian coalfield, on the railroad, bound for somewhere else, never to return. The brick street is very quiet now.